listening to the Drinks.com podcast, the business of online alcohol. I'm your host, Brandon Amoroso, and today I'm talking with Pedro Garcia, who's the managing director of USA and Canada for Felix Solis. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Brandon, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into all the exciting stuff that we've been chatting about pre-episode, can you give everybody a quick background just on yourself and sort of your career journey?
Sure. My name is Pedro Garcia. I'm a first-generation Cuban-American, born and raised here in South Florida, and I've had the privilege of being in the adult beverage industry for the last 23 years. This is all I've ever done. My first job was as a stock boy at a fine wine shop in Pinecrest while I was getting my undergrad. Spent about 2 years there, then got the opportunity to go work at National Distributing before they merged with RNDC, had a grocery route there. Spent about 18 months on the grocery side of the business and then got promoted through lots of tenacious attempts to catch the attention of the fine wine manager at National to give me an opportunity in my early 20s. And I was lucky enough to exhaust them and talk him into giving me a chance. And then I was able to spend about 7 years on the fine wine side of the business at the wholesale side. During the fine wine side of my career, represented incredible portfolios like Co-Brand, Penfolds, Consolidation, incredible brands like Fresgenet, Blackstone, Sassicaia, and so forth. During my time at the fine wine division, we lost a bunch of portfolios to Southern. Then I got the itch to want to learn the on-premise side of the business, and I got an opportunity to go work on the on-premise side of the business for Republic National, and finally learned that last bit of the distributor business that I didn't have under my belt. And thankfully to that decision, that kind of propelled me into the supplier job, because during a work with on the on-premise side, I met a gentleman by the name of Arturo Masolo, which ended up being a mentor and a very, very good friend for me, who actually got me my first supplier job after RNDC for a startup Spanish company who had no presence in the US market and were looking for somebody, young and aggressive who wanted to take a swing at it. And I remember Art, bringing this to me. And I'm like, Art, man, I can't do that. I have no idea how to launch a brand from scratch into the U.S. market. I just have distributor experience. And this great friend that he is, Art's like, look, just prep your resume, get some ideas ready, and I'll help you fine tune it. I think you can do it with my guidance. And I was lucky enough to get that chance. I worked for that company for about 18 months, and then I got another offer for a Argentinian group here based in Brickell called Transnational Foods. And Transnational Foods had a division of adult beverages called Pampa Beverage. And Pampa Beverages had the exclusive contracts for Quilmes beer in the U.S. We had some incredible wine brands from the north of Argentina in the Cafayate Valley called the La Vaque Vineyards, which is high altitude Salta wines, really, really incredible portfolio. And they also had a winery in San Rafael. So I took the position there as a regional sales manager, working under the national sales manager, which is a gentleman, that's still in the business, incredible friend called Paul. And Paul and I together grew that business very quickly. Then Paul moved on to another supplier opportunity. I naturally went up the ranks and got promoted to oversee the entire operation at Pampa Beverage, continuing to scale our distributor footprint, our retail relationships with whether it was a regional, a national, or a local chain that had at least 3 to 4 points of distribution for us to present our brands. And then I got another opportunity shortly about the 4-year mark with Pampa Beverage. I got an offer for a group called Puerto Viejo Wines, which is a family from Chile. And they have incredible brands here in the U.S. called Puerto Viejo. They have Los Riscos. And I was brought on as their director of national accounts with the sole purpose of activating their chain business and expanding their distributor network into new markets. So my priorities were simple: more chain business, more distributors, go attack as hard as you can. And I was only with that company for 11 months because during my tenure there, I got a phone call on a Sunday from Art Masolo. I'm like, what's Art doing calling me on a Sunday? It's about 4:30 on a Sunday and I'm getting a call from Art. Although I love Art, I was a little, perplexed by his call. And, fortunately I picked it up and I'm like, yeah, Art. He's like, Pedro, you're going to love me. I've got your next opportunity. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, I'm here in Pro Wine with my buddy Felix Solis Ramos, which is our, the marketing director and sales director for the company, the son of our current CEO, Don Felix. And he's like, I'm with my buddy Felix. We've been chatting. He's been looking for somebody for the US. And I told him he has to hire you. And I'm like, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And that was it. It was just some random call on a Sunday. And about a couple of weeks later, I got a follow-up call from Art telling me that a gentleman called Paul Cox was going to reach out to me and start the process. I didn't really hear anything else for like about another 2 to 3 weeks. And then fortunately, this gentleman, Paul Cox, which was the export director at that time for Felix Solis, overseeing the U.S. market in Canada, gave me a buzz. They put me through the ringer. They worked with a recruitment firm called Benchmark Recruitment out of Napa. And Don and Kent were awesome throughout the process. And, I was lucky enough to sell them on my vision of, how I would take this incredible, top 10 global wine company and establish them in the U.S. market and grow our distributor footprint and, break into the very difficult regional and national chains. And, 8 years later, here I am.
How much of your experience on the distributor side has lent itself well to being on the supplier side now?
Oh wow, that's a great question, and I think that knowing every aspect of the distributor, grocery, fine wine, which is the independent market, and the on-premise, I think that's given me a tremendous advantage. A lot of suppliers, don't even have distributor experience, and for somebody to have experience in all three divisions of a distributor, I think it's very handy. At the very least, it just gives you another weapon or tool to pull out of your arsenal or your toolbox to think about innovative ways to just get attention, whether you're trying to get attention of the manager, the sales team, and or if you're just trying to increase points of distribution. They're all just very different. So I think that, the way in which my career developed, which is literally from the bottom up, just throwing boxes in a warehouse and learning, has really armed me and prepared me with a good background to just ultimately be creative and disruptive as I grow this business and as I try to do my best. Ultimately, I just consider myself a very strategic thinker and somebody who doesn't have a problem doing something differently than it's been done and disrupting, the traditional, status quo in the industry.
Yeah, and the three-tier system is such a unique infrastructure that has been created in the U.S. that is, not something that if you only were selling internationally and then you just came into the U.S., like you're just not familiar with.
Yeah, but I feel like you baited me with the way you said that comment. Yeah, the three-tier system, it's outdated, for God's sakes. It's prehistoric. It's brick and mortars, waiting for waiting to take advantage of their zip codes in their areas. And it's been that way forever. And a lot of these people still don't want to change in the way they do business. So it's a shame. And then when you try to explain the three-tier system to European companies who are accustomed to doing business as direct as possible, then that just becomes a super fun and comical exercise because they just don't get it.
What was it like having to go through that?
Oh man, at the beginning, sitting down with, my owners is, one of the most incredibly business savvy gentlemen I've ever met. And I mean, our current CEO, Don Felix, is just a hardworking, incredibly talented man that, has built this, top 10 global wine company on his bare back through blood, sweat, and tears and nothing but just hard work and ethics. This man is, in his mid 70s and still works, 10 plus hour days, and he makes it look fun. So Don Felix is extremely unique. And his son, Felix, which is my direct report, Felix is an incredibly dynamic professional. Felix has a great diverse background, covering, many different types of retailers and distributors and markets. So where they're very savvy, it's still extremely difficult to make them understand the three-tier system and why, this person needs to make a minimum margin in this, state like Ohio, when there's, a mandated margin for, wholesalers and retailers, or control states, and, why we have to be careful, in Georgia and in Virginia on who we, sign a contract with, because then they're going to have the rights of that brand. And, why is this retailer, working on penny profits? This is crazy. Why don't they invest a little bit? So it was challenging, but at the end, they trusted in me to do what was necessary to ultimately achieve our strategic goals, which were, in phase one, which was simply to increase and activate distributors. We knew that we will not be a viable player in the U.S. market if we weren't extremely effective early on in activating distributor partners quickly, because it was only a matter of time. And I'm thankful that I was able to deliver that message of urgency early on, because my fears proved to be true through all the mergers and acquisitions in the space. You ask anybody trying to break into the U.S. market now, and to get the attention of any wholesaler has just become, almost impossible.
Yeah, it's been very concentrated, and if you are not within that sort of ecosystem, then you're outside of it.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I would be envious of anyone right now who's trying to break into the U.S. market in 2025.
Yeah, God, I can't even imagine trying to do what I replicated in the last 8 years in this current environment. To be very, very honest with you, I think it'll prove to be extremely difficult.
You've been in the industry, your entire professional career. What do you think has changed the most in a positive sense, and that you're even, excited about going into the future with future change within the
Look, what am I excited about the most is that I finally start to see a continuation of more interested and more educated gatekeepers / buyers at big regional and national accounts finally waking up to the fact that, hey, maybe the way we've been doing it isn't the best way at all. And maybe if we want to be resilient in the face of headwinds and all these global ups and downs, i.e., COVID, logistical bottlenecks, tariffs and so forth, then the only way to do it is to try to be as direct as possible. So, I find that to be extremely refreshing, because I've been on the supplier side now for over 14 years. And at the beginning of that 14-year tenure, nobody gave a shit, pardon my French, nobody cared. Nobody cared. And none of these buyers cared that it was a winery direct model, that I was the winery and the importer, and that this is the future because of the fact that there's no additional middleman margins baked into the pie. But now, the business environment has become so challenging that, they need to pay attention to that supply chain and ensure that they're sourcing their products the best possible way. So I'm excited about that, because that's been a big driver of our growth. And I'm excited, I don't see it as much, but I'm very excited to see what, this fourth tier can bring to the space, and that's where drinks comes in, right? Zach, I remember the first time I ever met Zach out in LA, and I'm like, this guy is a genius. This guy is onto something incredible. And I think that the biggest gains in the adult beverage space are still yet to come. But it's about, deploying the right strategies and, meeting the consumer where the consumers are. And I think that e-com is the answer.
Well, this leads me right into, a low-hanging e-com question, which is, there's still not a huge penetration of e-commerce within beverage alcohol. If you look at the stats, every other category is at least, 3 to 10x, percentage of market share in terms of sales actually going through e-com versus traditional. And I know, as we were talking before this, that, you don't have a direct presence yet. How do you see that changing? Is it out of necessity? Is it, what are the current sort of gatekeeping factors to why there's not a bigger presence for direct within the U.S. and really just internationally as a whole?
I think that the bigger players have already deployed their direct to consumer e-com strategies. I think obviously they've got the budgets and the teams to launch these a lot faster than emerging families and or brands in the U.S. market. Felix Solis has not launched its own DTC platform because we're solely focused on winning where we're strong. And Felix Solis, the way that Felix Solis is built as a company and how we've really built a reputation of success in the 122 countries where we trade is, really on the off-premise. We're huge. We're huge partners with big box retailers across the globe, and that's where we wanted to focus on first in the U.S. market. So why did we aggressively focus on winning there first is because of the fact that we had proven track records in Europe, and we can leverage that track record to these gatekeepers in the U.S. market and try to force a seat at the table, or at the very least just a test program with these retailers. So is Felix Solis interested in having these direct to consumer platforms? Absolutely. That is something we're gonna look at eventually. It's not in the works yet, but I see that being a good opportunity for us to drive more of our premium plus brands from the northern DOs like Rioja and Ribera del Duero and Toro and Valdepeñas, which is the birthplace of Felix Solis as well.
Yeah, I think the online category lends itself particularly well to that mid-tier price range or above. Whereas when you're under a certain price threshold, there is something that is unique to just you walk into the store and you're grabbing something off the shelf, and maybe it doesn't require as much education or as much background on the actual wine, and then it comes into play a lot of other factors that can help with differentiation. But you mentioned and everybody is talking about it, sort of the headwinds that have been facing alcohol in general, but specifically wine in the U.S. and North America at large. What do you view those as, and how are you combating those within Felix Solis?
So, obviously the entire wine industry is in the U.S. is worried. We've been down, 8 to 9% for the last 2 years. The younger, the data is the younger consumers aren't drinking as much as, the boomers, and that they haven't fully taken to wine yet. What are we doing to combat this? Honestly, look, we're not trying to aggressively, appeal to the millennials or to the boomers. What we're trying to do just goes back to our original mission statement. And we're just trying to keep it as simple as possible. We want to produce the best wine at the best price so that everybody can have a good bottle of wine on their table. And we're going to deliver that via the best supply chain. So I think that, in these types of tough, inflationary periods, when we're having these down turns and trends and negative trends in wine consumption, I think that consumers at the end of the day are intelligent, and I think that consumers are going to want to look for, brands and products that over-deliver price point to quality. And that's what Felix Solis is focused on doing. We want to make sure that when we're selling that $12, $13 bottle of wine, it drinks like a $20, $25 bottle of wine.
Yeah, I think the consumers increasing in terms of savviness every year. And, the BS detector, as I like to call it, is, tenfold what it was 15 years ago,
For
10
sure.
years ago,
For
even
sure.
5 years.
For sure, that's a good point. And and another thing, that's a wonderful point. I think the days of these corporately owned private labels, that have been owning and penetrating the U.S. market for such a long time, I think those days are coming to an end as well. The younger demographic, the first thing they do when they see any product, not just adult bev, is they Google it. They go online and they want to learn about it. On the back of every bottle of wine that Felix Solis produces and imports into the U.S. market, we proudly display the Felix Solis name via QR code, and the consumers can track that back all the way to our website, where we're redirecting them to the family story. This is a real family This family was built on hard work, blood, sweat, and tears back in 1952. 72 years later, we're a top 10 global company and 100% family owned. And I think for most Americans, that's an exciting story because at the end of the day, that's just an American dream, right?
Yeah, it really is the epitome of it. And consumers, especially the younger generation, are shopping experiences more than they are any other generation prior. If you look at some of these big brand labels or names, that's far less interesting to, a 25-year-old who's more experiential driven and wants to be, goes beyond just the label. It's like, what is actually behind that label? And the status associated with labels in the past is not exactly what is being purchased now.
Yeah, totally. And and these younger consumers are also looking at what's your social purpose, right? What's your green print for to reduce your carbon footprint with on the globe. And Felix Solis is taking strides on all those areas. We're going to launch a solar farm to help reduce our energy consumption in our main site. Our state-of-the-art barrel facility that we just unveiled 2 years ago in June, it's the most state-of-the-art barrel facility in the entire wine industry, 100% robotically controlled, temperature controlled, humidity controlled. And that entire wine barrel facility, which holds 130,000 barrels, is 100% solar powered and off the grid. So I think these things are important as well. And I think that Felix Solis has, at least in the last 8 years since I've been here, has always had a strategic long-term vision to make sure that we're checking the boxes, not only to make ourselves more efficient and a technological leader in the wine space, but to also make sure that we take care of Mother Nature along the way. Because if, at the end of the day, wine is agriculture. Without good grapes, we're not going to have good wine.
I think that lends itself well to, even if you aren't selling direct to consumer, you need to have an online presence, because what you just told me is significantly more difficult, if not impossible, to get across to a consumer who's just walking down an aisle that has hundreds of different options for them to choose from.
Yep.
And so being able to have that presence online and share those stories and share that background and history is increasingly important.
We have a small amount of online presence. Our biggest partner on e-com is definitely Vivino. We work a lot with Vivino. We gave them a first rights to have an exclusive to one of our fastest growing brands globally, which is called Mucho Mas. And we launched that with them about 2 years ago. And fast forward to today, it's our top selling SKU with Vivino.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's cool to see, idea and strategy actually play out in terms of real tangible results. You mentioned people Googling as well. One of the things that I've been seeing more and more is they're skipping Google and they're going straight to TikTok, or they're going straight to ChatGPT. And I think that's going to be an increasingly interesting dynamic for the wine industry to figure out, because, the traditional Google search going into wine search or going into Vivino, I've been shocked at how often people just go straight to TikTok. And so they're going to search Felix Solis on TikTok. They're not going to search it on Google, or they're going to search it on ChatGPT instead. And making sure that you're set up for success within these different and new, essentially, search engines is increasingly important.
Yeah, look, I think that I have to give credit to our marketing department and then Felix. I know they're very aware of the changing landscape with technology and how quickly it's evolving. And I know that we're making an effort to make sure that we're not left behind the rest of the crowd, for sure.
What's one thing that just keeps you up at night about the industry, that you're like, I still can't believe that we have to do it this way?
I still can't believe we have to do it this way. Yeah, I still I have to be careful with this question. I understand the 3-tier system, and I understand the value of the 3-tier system, and and it creates jobs along the line. So I've worked in every one of the tiers along my career. So it's interesting to see how the Europeans do it and how the Americans do it. So to see huge players like Tesco and Ahold in Europe being able to buy directly from a winery is a huge advantage in Europe when it comes to cost quality relationship. And obviously that's not the case in the US, and then I can imagine at some point, not having a need maybe for retailers. That'll be cool if we can just go straight from distributor to retailer. There'll be some huge savings if the e-com or the software advances enough where that can make sense somehow. And I guess this is where the fourth tier is coming in. I think, that can be very disruptive in the future.
Yeah, I mean, with the rise of influencers, they are essentially they are the movie stars of 2025 for the younger generation. I've so many family friends who their kids talk about people who I have no idea who they are. And then I look them up on, TikTok and they have 30 million followers or something, whereas if you looked at like traditional celebrities, they might have like 500,000 followers on TikTok, if even having a TikTok at all. And even the content they consume is like content on YouTube or content on TikTok. They're not going and watching a 3-hour movie. They can't even pay attention to something for longer than 30 seconds. So, it's a changing dynamic in terms of where people are getting their trusted like sources of information and referrals. And you see a lot of influencers starting their own brands, but that's not necessarily their strong suit. And the fourth tier lends itself well to being able to curate your own sort of assortment and collection and to do some of these partnerships that ultimately lead to more distribution and sales for the winery itself.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'd be excited to see an influencer launch an adult beverage brand in a very effective way where, they can kind of turn, flip the hat or the coin on the head of the celebrity driven brands that have dominated the U.S. market for so long.
So I got two fun questions for you here before we wrap up.
You told me about?
Yes. So we've had a couple of guests. I wouldn't call it cheating, but they did some digging and got to the questions beforehand. But I think you're coming in cold here. But they're not too crazy. But first question is, if you had to share a bottle of wine with anyone, who would that person be? Who would it be, and what would you drink?
Oh, who would it be, and what would I drink? Okay, that's a great question. It'll definitely be vintage champagne, and I'll drink it with my incredible wife. Thanks to my wife, I'm a better person, and I'm a father, and I can't think of a person more worthy of sharing a great bottle of champagne with than my amazing wife.
I love that. Is there one particular vintage champagne that stands out to you?
Yeah, that's, I feel like you have an inside scoop. Who did you speak to that knows me or something? This is funny. So there is a special bottle of vintage champagne that's connected to my wife and I, and I was lucky enough to serve it at our wedding. I found 2 magnums of Champagne Charlie 1985 while working the market in Maryland many, many years ago, and the owner or manager of that store was kind enough to let me take that off his hands at a very ridiculous price. And Monica and I drank one of those magnums on our wedding day, and then we drank another one of those magnums, some years later. So yeah, Champagne Charlie 1985 was wonderful 10 years ago when we drank it. I'm not sure if it's going to be drinking as good today, but vintage champagne is definitely something my wife and I like to drink when we can do it. It's gotten too expensive.
Very expensive, but I think that's one of the cool aspects of wine that should be, tapped into more, especially when it comes to like marketing to consumers, is how experiential it is. It's, I would argue, less about the juice that's in the bottle and more about the people that you're with, the setting that you're in, all the other intangibles that go into that. I mean, I imagine you would not be drinking that vintage champagne. I mean, alone could also be awesome, but like it's not the same as when you're in a setting, when you're with them.
I believe in what you said so much that the majority of our below the line investments in the U.S. market has been very strategically spent on the fact that we've been taking a lot of people to Spain to see it with their own 2 eyes, to walk the vineyards, to walk the winery, to drink the wine in Spain, to have the food, and to build that experience with the distributor sales force and managers. We've invested tremendously in doing that. And in return, we've been able to really activate lots of brand ambassadors behind the Felix Solis umbrella, really pushing that same story via a very passionate way, because they actually had that experience and they're sharing it with their customers and their friends. So that is something that I believe to the core of me. Not only do I believe it now that I have the opportunity to deploy these types of incentives to my distributor base, but I remember back on my first trip, my first wine trip ever was to Oregon. And I remember that trip like if it was yesterday, and it was life-changing, and I loved every bit of it.
Yeah, the experience is something that cannot be replicated. And I love that you are investing in that and actually bringing people out there, because, that'll show off in ways that, we probably can't even imagine when it comes to how it impacts the ability to educate the consumer and actually get that story through.
I always tell my distributors, and I always tell my retail partners or my import partners, hearing it is one thing, but seeing it is believing it.
Yeah. So last fun question. What is your favorite wine memory?
My favorite wine memory. Okay. That's another good question. My favorite wine memory. God, there's so many. I've been on so many great trips, and I love wine so much, and wine's such a part of my DNA and my culture. I think my favorite wine memory is a time where I didn't even get to drink the wine. It was I had a bottle of 1982 Haut-Brion in my wine cellar that I had found many, many years ago, and I was saving. And I get home, and my grandfather is sitting outside of our house having a burger, and what do I see on the table? The bottle of 1982 Haut-Brion, and my grandfather looking at me with this incredibly innocent, almost childlike face, telling me, "Man, this bottle's really good. Do you have any more?" And I'm like, wow, and I remember at the time being upset, but it was for like 5 seconds, and then like something struck me immediately where like, just sit down and enjoy this memory with your grandfather, because you're going to remember it for the rest of your life. And this is a cool, funny story of how that 82 got drank. So to me, that is probably one of my wine stories that I'll never forget, because my grandfather was in it, and it was that bottle of wine that I was obsessively saving for the right occasion that never came, but my grandfather decided to have it with a great burger, and it was awesome.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and all of your insights. I really appreciate it. But before we hop, can you let people who are listening know where they can find and connect with you or the Felix Solis brand online?
Yeah, absolutely. So my email address is pgarcia@felixsolisavantis.com. And you can find the Felix Solis wines all over the U.S., Sam's Club, Costco, Food Lion, Meijer, Fresh Market, Winn-Dixie, Hannaford. We have good distribution in the U.S., and our brands are growing. And for all of you who see the Felix Solis brand out there, just know that we're very focused on producing the best wine at the best price.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. For everybody who's listening, as always, this is Brandon Amoroso. You can find us at drinks.com. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.